Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. I'm doing it Thursday late afternoon because I gotta go do a bunch of stuff tomorrow, so I wanted to make sure to get this out on time when I had plenty of time to do it and I didn't need to rush through. So as always, if I miss anybody's question, please just repost it in next week or this week's Q&A, wherever it is that you support, and I promise I never skip questions. It's only because they came in after I started recording, or if I just did something silly like accidentally deleted the file in post. But anyway, let's jump in and see what we got. First up, over on the YouTube community, Scotter140 said that once in a while the picture will cut out to a black screen for a second when they're playing Super Nintendo. They're using an OSSC, FX Pack Pro, and have an LG C9 OLED. The OSSC is set to generic 5x, and the TV is on game mode. Any idea what might be causing this? It seems to happen at random. I've tried different HDMI cables, but I haven't had a chance to do any troubleshooting yet. The OSSC is from Video Game Perfection, and the SCART cable is from Insurrection Industries. So my guess on this would be that's a 5x incompatibility with that television. The year seems to make a difference, less so than the model, so I don't know when the C9s were made. I have a C6. That was from 2016, and it barely works at all in 5x mode anymore, which is strange because when I first got the TV, it did, and then after a firmware update, it didn't at all, and I just kind of gave up after that. So my first guess on that would be it's something to do with the TV, but the easiest way by far to check is set it to 3x mode or even to 2x mode, but 3x should be fine, and then just play it that way. And if it seems to work fine without any dropouts whatsoever, that's the issue. It's just a compatibility thing. If your TV has any kind of G-Sync or any kind of features that go a step farther than game mode, I would definitely try those just to be safe. But if that's the case, there's not really much else you could do other than put another scaler in between. But even that, even something like a DVDO that would add less than a frame of lag, I'm not really sure if that's worth it overall. It might be, depending on your needs and how much you want the Super Nintendo and 5X in that setup. Now, if it does still happen in 3X mode, I would start swapping things out one piece at a time, which stinks because if you don't have friends that live near you that would lend you this stuff, you might end up having to buy extras. But you bought the OSSC from the right place to get it from, Video Game Perfection. The SCART cable is from Insurrection Industries, which is known to make good cables. All three of the major cable manufacturers have been pretty consistent, but nobody's perfect. Nobody, especially not me. So I'm certainly not pointing fingers. So it could be the cable. It could be a ground issue. It could be a million different things. But I would start by switching it to 3X and go from there, and then kind of troubleshoot down the line. And of course, if you need any help, feel free to keep firing away. Now, over on Patreon, Focus said, no question for me this week, just popping in to say thanks for all the work you do. Much love. Well, thank you very much for the kind words. I really appreciate that. And it's more proof that I really do read these in real time. I didn't even notice before I booted the page. Thank you. Photos Fine said, last week I was talking about a NES mod that changes out the entire internal power supply and the RF box. Which mod is that? Sounds like something I would like to do on one of my NESs. It's the one from the Real Phoenix. It's from December 7th was the post. I'll try to remember to leave a link below for anybody that just wants a direct link to it. But it's a mod that I absolutely love. I've been waiting on this one for a while. It's in fact sitting in a box kind of over there right next to me. I'm just waiting to get Cousin Scott's NES to do it on his. But it replaces the RF module, which is a pain to get out. I used heat to get mine. I think Jose did it manually. But you have to remove that, which is a giant pain. You put this in its place, and it's completely no cut. It has audio and video on the right side, just like a normal NES would, but it's actually getting composite video from the NES RGB. It's got the power receptacle jack. It's got an S-video port where the RF switch was. And you might have to cut a little bit of your S-video cable to get it to fit in, but who cares? It's just cutting a cable. And then it's got a 9-pin mini DIN, which is Genesis 2 style. So you just have to mod the NES RGB properly to make sure you're sending the correct signal. And then any Genesis 2 cable will work, which is SCART cables, HD Retrovision, Rad2X, whatever. I really think this is great, both because I'm a huge fan of no-cut mods, but also the original RF box, the big cap inside of that is always leaking now. It's starting to get almost as bad as the Game Gears and the Xbox one, in that in the past 4 years, every time I've opened one up, I've seen it do some minor damage, and once the fluid leaks out enough, the power is going to stop working, and then the board itself will rot away, and you'll kind of be forced to do one of these mods to it. So if you want to keep your NES completely stock, definitely start thinking about replacing. I would replace all the caps because there aren't too many of them, but without a doubt, the one in the RF box, which once again stinks because it's a giant pain to get off. And if you have an NES RGB kit, or if you were planning on installing one, this one certainly seems to be a really good alternative that doesn't allow you to cut anything and get you a power circuit right in it. Michael Vu wants to know if I know of an N64 mod they could do to internally bypass needing to have an expansion pack. I've heard of it a little bit before, but I haven't actually seen any info on it. So by the expansion pack, I'm assuming you just mean the memory module that sits on the top of the N64 console itself, just under that main door. And I've never heard anybody talk about modding that or changing it at all. I guess if you were making a handheld N64, you would probably solder that directly or do some kind of mod, but if you're keeping it in console form, I don't think there's really any need for that whatsoever. I don't think you would be able to gain anything from it either, but maybe I'm completely wrong. Please, if anybody has any other info on this, and especially reasons why people might benefit from it, definitely let me know. But I haven't heard anything about it, and I don't really know why anybody would need to do that. Once again, unless you were trying to make a really small handheld version, but then you would probably want to make some kind of custom adapter so you didn't need to slot it in. You would just solder all of the pins directly to save space. So interesting question, but I got nothing for you. I'm sorry. Pablo Romero said, can I guide them a bit on understanding gamma boost? They like using dark scan lines with the OSSC, and they program them in a way that the thickness changes from thin to thick depending on the color, similar to a PVM. Some mods like the Ultra HDMI allow a gamma boost that helps with the brightness loss from adding scan lines. I would like to emulate this in some way with the OSSC and or OLED settings. So their questions are, what does the gamma boost really do? Is it not just a brightness boost? I think it is kind of a brightness boost, and that's the easiest way to describe it, but changing the gamma is a little bit different than changing the brightness because it kind of changes how everything blooms out around it. But I don't know. I think it might be different depending on the device that you're using, depending on the setting that you're using. So I really think a good way to visualize it would just be a brightness boost, even though I know the experts are probably screaming at their screen right now, mad that I'm describing it this way, but I think it is a fair way to visualize it. Next, on the open source scan converter, I think I should increase the offset and then gain for making the image brighter without crushing blacks, but I'm not sure. And on the TV, I think I should increase brightness first and then color to compensate the washed out colors, but this will mess up every console that uses the OSSC. My main problem is I don't have a test to check if what I'm doing is right. I'm just eyeballing it. Hope you could help. So that's a really interesting one. And scan lines are always a tricky thing to get right on TVs. Some people like the look, some people don't. Some people feel like they've dialed in something that their eyes completely appreciate as much as a CRT, and there's no real right answer for it other than if you're using dark scan lines, you probably should boost the image a bit. If it were me, I would just turn up the brightness on my TV and kind of be done with it, but I'm also not the biggest fan of fake scan lines on a flat panel yet. I hope someone comes up with a pretty accurate CRT mask, so it's the horizontal scan lines, and I call them vertical scan lines sometimes. That's not a thing. That's not real. You're looking at the CRT mask, but it's much like my gamma description. It is a good way of visualizing or explaining to people what your eyes might see. So until the whole thing gets close to what a PVM or a consumer grade TV would look like, I don't usually mess with them. And every time I say that, there's a bunch of people who offer great suggestions on how to tweak the OSSC and other devices. And I've tried pretty much all of them, and they're good, but it's still not the same, and certainly not the same feel. So if it were me, I would mess with whatever settings work in your combination of stuff. The fact that you're using an OLED will probably help because black is always just black, so you don't have to worry about turning it up like on a cheap LCD where if you turn the brightness up, the whole thing's got like a gray glow to it. So you're probably ahead of the curve there, but I would try all of the things that you said. Mess with OSSC settings, mess with your TV settings, and just try to find something that that works out the best. However, I would start with the OSSC so you could save it as a profile. So that way you could go in and say, Super Nintendo scanlines on, save that profile, Super Nintendo scanlines off. So now you've dialed the brightness down and all that, save that profile too. So sorry, I couldn't be more of a help on that one because I've spent so much time trying to get scanlines dialed in and never had anything that I loved. So I kind of gave up for the short term, and hopefully we'll have solutions in the next year or so for people or for ways to get better scanlines or different ways to do it. TJ says, I know I'm very early on this, but I had a few questions about the N64 digital. I currently have the RGB mod installed. Is the N64 digital install even possible? So based on their website, they're saying that it can also output RGB and component video. So my guess would be that they're going to say remove whatever mod you already have installed and then put this one in its place and let this one take care of everything. It might not be the case, but that's my guess. Also, do I think I'll be doing a review on this device? Definitely in some way or another, whether it's a collaboration or just my own review, something's going to happen around launch day. Hopefully I'll get one before then so I could test it at least. But I will be involved in some kind of review no matter what. And any thoughts on throwing in M Classic comparisons? Well, right on their own website, they said they're looking into smoothing options. And if that's the case, adding the M Classic would look terrible. It would double smooth, and it just like the comparisons I did on the PlayStation video, the PS1 digital, it just wasn't worth using at all. And to be perfectly honest, I've been very clear about my thoughts on the M cable and the M Classic, and I find it to be utterly useless in most cases. But it's zero lag added, and if you already own one, it would be something that it's certainly harmless to try. But there's been so few use cases where I've actually seen a benefit, and that's especially any kind of pre-HD era stuff, regardless of what it's been scaled to. But I know a lot of people want to know the answer to that question, so I will absolutely throw something in there in the video. But my gut's telling me that if the launch day firmware has smoothing built in, like they said on their website, it's going to be much better than anything the M Classic could do. JK Lax wants to know how important it is to keep the metal RF shields in older consoles. They're about to do some mods on a few consoles like NES and Genesis, and while the boards are in good shape, the RF shields are a bit rough, and the shells are dirty and need cleaning. I'm curious about your opinion regarding throwing out the RF shields completely during reassembly and after shell cleaning and modding. So I kind of have mixed feelings about that. I leave them all on for my consoles personally, but there's a big argument that you might not need them, and proof of that is Japanese Master System and Genesis consoles don't have them at all because their FCC regulations were worried about different types of interference than North America, so they just didn't need it, whereas they always were shipped, and definitely in North America, and I believe in Europe as well. Could be wrong about that. I don't know much about the PAL stuff, but so you could say that with consoles like the Genesis, where in other regions they didn't have the RF shield, you might not need to use it at all. But you could also argue that, any more shielding protection couldn't hurt, so why not? The only scenario in which I wouldn't put it back in is if you had one that was really rusted. Now, you could, of course, sand it down, put it in a sandblaster or whatever to get rid of the rust, and then, spray it with some clear coat or something to make sure it doesn't re-rust. But generally speaking, if you have stuff in good condition and you're tearing it apart, but the metal shields are all rusted and rotting out, you don't want to put rust near anything metal. So that would be the only scenario in which I wouldn't put one back on. But I mean, it's something that you could certainly try, right? Do some tests, hook it up to your setup, and then take the metal shield off and see if it makes a difference. But it's just something that I would leave on. And another question, does the triple bypass disable sound output on the headphone jack on a Model 1 Genesis? Yes, however, there's a way to re-enable that. You have to do I think you have to tap certain points on the triple bypass board itself and do a small mod to the Genesis 1 board. I think Tien was talking about maybe eventually making a version of it that has the pads right there, but I'm not sure if anybody ever got around to that. So, I guess I would just kind of look around for information, maybe check Tien Feng's Twitter posts, maybe Jose's as well, and see if you could find anything in there. And, I've been saying I'll try to get installation instructions up on the wiki since the triple bypass project started, but the truth is doing documentation on that is like per console revision, like a full day's work. And, obviously the wiki is, a consistent, never-ending work. So I just don't have enough time in the day to get to any of that. I don't even have enough time to do stuff that I really need to be doing. So, I'll try my best to get to that when I can. But I think for now, you're probably going to have to poke through Twitter and forums in order to get the answer. Tyrant Rex said a while ago they found a Neo Geo Pocket Color in a box at a thrift store for next to nothing. Everything works perfectly, but they would like to install a backlit screen of some kind. They've come across one on a website that requires no soldering. Do I have any other suggestions of mods I should look at? Well, if you mean do I have any other suggestions of LCD mods, I would just search RetroRGB and see all of the different options that have popped up over the past few years and see if there's any updates, and then just pick the one that you would like. I don't remember which was the first. I think there was one up on AliExpress that was a clone of the first. I don't quite remember it. There's a lot of different LCD options available for different handhelds now, so I would just kind of do some research into that. But if you meant, do I have any suggestions of other mods besides the LCD screen? I mean, if it's got capacitors, replace them. That's pretty much it. I don't know of anything else available out there at the moment. I would do a little bit of research, though. You never know. Maybe there's a speaker upgrade or something else. But overall, I think it's a pretty straightforward console, and they've been pretty reliable. And the only upgrade I've really heard is the screen upgrade to it. A couple of questions from Jason Guffey. First, they picked up a SCART to S-Video converter from LinuxBot 3000 and want to know how to get VGA to S-Video in the same scenario. And specifically, it would have to be RGB HV at 15 kilohertz, just like SCART. And the answer to that is kind of complicated, and you would definitely need to buy something else, unfortunately. Mike Chi released an open source design that's the VGA to SCART, which essentially is what you just said. You put your VGA in your audio, it outputs SCART. You could probably even use a SCART coupler and just kind of connect it like that for when you want to switch back and forth. You could just get the LinuxBot 3000 converter that's RGB HV or RGBS or to S-Video as well. Or you could try to get Tim Worthington's SCART head that has a VGA connector and a jack in it. And I keep begging other people to make these as well. Different versions, not to rip off Tim's design, but just different spins on it. And I've had people actually come back and say nobody would want that, which drives me absolutely crazy because you obviously want it, I want it, lots of people want it, but I just, for some reason, I keep having a hard time getting people to make these. I think a cable or a SCART head, kind of like Tim's, but with a slightly different integration, would probably be the easiest. And specifically something with a switch on it that allows you to say RGBS, and that's just for people using D-sub connectors, or you flip a switch on it and it has a sync combiner built in for people sending RGB HV. I've begged people to make it, and hopefully somebody will listen finally. Also, you said your plan was to use GBS control to downscale higher res signals and then output the monitor via the LinuxBot adapter. Yeah, that's the exact scenario I just discussed for any of these solutions. Or, of course, you could try to make your own sync combiner based on the design that Steve posted. But, I mean, that's a bit complicated, and depending on your budget, it might just be easier to pick any of these up. Also, you said you found the DVDO VP50 is also capable of downscaling under the right settings, and it supports RGB output via BNC connectors. This route seems much easier as I only need a cable with the SCART connector on one end and BNC connectors on the other. So where do you recommend I get an appropriate breakout cable like that? Since the LinuxBot adapter uses RGBS, I want one where H and V sync are on the same cable, correct? Well, in the scenario you're talking about with a VP50, it would be the same thing in that if it outputs RGB HV, that's VGA, so you would still need a solution to sync combine. If you're able to get it to output RGBS, you could just use one of those cables from Retro Gaming Cables UK that has a switch in it. I actually might have one of those right here to show as well. Yeah, so it's tangled, excuse me. So it's a SCART cable with some BNC adapters and a switch that makes this input or output. So that way you could either use this on like a G-SCART switch and output to a monitor, or you could go from exactly what you're saying to SCART. But I don't remember if the VP50 allows for RGBS, and mine's in storage, so I wouldn't be able to look up for you now. The only thing I will say is I did try to make the VP50 downscale, and it didn't work right. There were different things it could do, but it wasn't something I would go out and buy for downscaling capabilities. Now, that being said, if you already own one, by all means, try it. It's not going to hurt anything, but I certainly wouldn't hunt one down just for that reason. And lastly, how do I organize or attempt to all of my supplies, such as cables, adapters, tools, etc.? So because I live in a closet, everything is boxed and it's jammed anywhere it can go, so I could try to look somewhat like an adult when people come over. So my standing desk is a bunch of plastic bins I got from Target 20 years ago, and on top of it is a like the top of standing desk thing, so I could raise or lower it, but it's always standing. And there's 8 bins underneath, which I keep everything. There's also stuff like banker's boxes, I've seen them called. It's basically like those boxes that you could keep files in. And a long time ago, I got a bunch of cardboard ones, but every time it was really humid out, it would kind of smell like cardboard. So I eventually bought some plastic ones, which were super expensive, but durable as heck. And there's some IKEA ones for those too, but those fall apart. The little screws that hold them together always back out. So I use those. I've seen a lot of people use plastic bins. But the only issue with those is because they're not square. Sometimes not only do you not get as much space out of them, but they're harder to store in places. I think I gave mine away, if I remember correctly. But if I had the space to do it, I would like a bit of an OCD method of keeping everything organized in some way, so both that I could find it easily and so I don't have to unpack stuff every time I want to use it. Because that's one of the biggest problems I have now, is just I have a pretty awesome workflow directly here in front of me. So shooting a quick video like these that don't require big production, testing video signals on a scope, testing different devices, it's all fairly easy. But anything outside of what I do daily, I have to go under a bed, unbox one thing, go up on top of a shelf, get something out of another box. So I would, in my dream scenario, I would have something kind of similar to this, but all located in the same area and easily accessible. But that's just my little venting my frustration on it. I actually don't really have any suggestions other than, put them in bins and label them and stuff like that. Daniel Lodato wanted to follow up with the discussion from last week where they were only getting one audio channel out of their Saturn, and it looks like it wasn't the Saturn's fault, it was all the fault of the Bandridge Switchbox. That's pretty typical. A lot of people buy those, the non-powered Bandridge, and they work fine and they don't have any problems, but I hear of a lot of people having issues either right out of the box or exactly like you explained. So, if you have one of those and it's working, cool. But if you have one of those and you start to have any issues, that would be the first thing I would troubleshoot, is remove the switch, plug in directly, and do you still have the issue? So it's a common problem. But I mean, buying cheap stuff like that to start out, there's nothing wrong with it. It's not like it's going to harm your setup. So, that I do prefer the Otaku switches because those certainly are fairly priced and are well built. But I understand sometimes they take forever to ship because of everything going on and all that stuff. So, I totally get using one, but definitely make that your first thing to troubleshoot whenever issues arise. The other question from Daniel, though, they said they were originally planning on switching to HD Retrovision component cables and getting a G-Comp switch. But since the price is high and their TV only supports the OSSC 3X mode, they were thinking of just getting RAD2X cables. Before I pulled the trigger, I wanted to hear your thoughts. So in your specific scenario, you already have an OSSC and it's already running in 720p mode. So you would really want to take a look at your overall workflow and your overall console scenario. So let's just hypothetically say you have a Sega Saturn and a Nintendo 64, and that's the only retro consoles you use, and everything else is modern consoles. In that case, yeah, sell the OSSC, get two Rad2X cables, use the smoothing filter on both of them whenever you're playing games with 3D graphics. It won't look as sharp as the OSSC in 3X mode, but it'll definitely look good. You get the bonus of the filter. It's totally fine. But if you already have a bunch of consoles with SCART cables, even if you expressed your dislike for them, if you already have a bunch of consoles with those, SCART can be a pain, but if the cables are well made, it's totally fine. So I would either stick with what you got and just buy a different switch, or upgrading to HD Retrovision's totally fine. But if you already have a bunch of consoles, it's not very cost effective in most scenarios to get a Rad2X for each and every one of them. As far as compatibility goes and other scalers and stuff like that, there are other scalers being planned. There's nothing I ever talk about until release date, but I don't think... I mean, some people have teased pictures, other people have not, but it's not unfair of me to say other people are planning on making scalers. I don't think anybody's surprised by that. And when these scalers come out, it's going to offer different options, different compatibilities and stuff like that. So if you already have a bunch of retro consoles and you already have some cables, I would either stick with that or upgrade your cables. All future scalers should work with all of this stuff, so it should be fine. And the situation of the Rad2X, well, I still love those. I am not talking anything bad about the Rad2X cables. It's just when you're buying one for many, many consoles, it's not always the most cost effective and it's not always the best option, especially if you don't need the smoothing filter. So if you wanted it for the Genesis and Super Nintendo or Saturn for all of the 2D games, you'd never turn it on. But if you play 3D games from the Saturn or N64, that filter is pretty amazing. So I'll leave that up to you to decide, but it's basically just about workflow and total cost at the end of the day. But just remember, switching to the Rad2X, now you have these awesome little HDMI cables as spares if you ever need them, but that kind of skips any future scaler that doesn't have an HDMI input, which not all will, which for all the obvious reasons. So hopefully I was able to point you in the right direction. 2 from Goodnight. First, has there been any work on a smoothing filter for the open source scan converter? I love the RetroTink's smoothing filter when it's used with N64 stuff, and was looking for something similar I could use on the OSSC, mainly for GameCube and Wii games. Excellent question. I vaguely remember on the Shmups forum a couple years ago, somebody posting a custom forked firmware that allowed for HQ2X, which would essentially do pretty much the same thing, and I don't know whatever happened to that. I kind of remember Marcus saying there wasn't enough room in the official firmware to fit everything, so you would have to hunt down this firmware, load it up, and test it. But I agree that, like the question I was just talking about before, that smoothing style filter I think is amazing for 3D graphics. I think it is hideous on 2D graphics, but no, I don't think most people have ever suggested that you're supposed to use those on 2D graphics. So I would really look into that. If anybody wouldn't mind posting a link to Shmups in the comments, and just a word to everybody listening as well. A lot of links get caught in filtering on YouTube. So if you post a link and the comment doesn't appear for a few hours, it's because it got caught in the, hey, is this link safe? And I have to manually go allow it. So, please don't think I'm like editing your stuff or anything like that. Sometimes it just takes a while to kick in. But if anybody wants to post a link to that firmware, I lost it. I don't know what, I had it saved and I meant to try it and never got around to it. But I would also love to just do a very basic, here's the RetroTink 2X with a Nintendo 64 in the Super Mario World or Super Mario 64 opening. And then here it is through the OSSC with a filter on in 2X, 3X, 4X, 5X modes. And I'd really like to see which one has the more desired effect, if there really is a difference at all. So if anybody listening has a link to that, please share. And second thing from Goodnight, not a question, but to add on to the discussion last week, I would love to see some high-quality custom Genesis shells, especially Model 2. Big fan of custom shells, buttons, and the like. It's super sad to see the older consoles not get the same love as GameCube controllers, Dreamcast consoles, etc. Anyone who would make them has my money. I agree 100%. And, I know I already talked about this, but a rare moment that I don't mind repeating this. That clear Saturn shell that I had, it looked so good. And when I went to cut the hole for the SPDIF audio connector, I went, oh man, I don't want to cut this console. I don't want to. Wait a minute, this is the aftermarket case. This is like what you're supposed to be doing to these. And I did a decent enough job, and at first glance, you wouldn't even notice that it was something that somebody added. But it was really cool, both because it looked better than the yellowed and cracked original that was on there, and I didn't feel the slightest bit bad modding it. And to that end, I would love to see a Genesis 2 shell with maybe even like the one for the PC Engine where it has the guides if you want to cut for the port. Maybe it would even have the guides in back, so you could just very easily take a drill and drill out holes for RCA connectors, S-video mods, whatever else. So that way you could have a Swiss cheese case with all of the different outputs broken out, so you could have simultaneous composite S-video and RGB out if you wanted. I get really sad when I see that on original consoles because most people don't want or need all of that. But I get excited when I see that on aftermarket shells because it's like, that's what these things were designed for. Make it your own, make it unique, save the original in a box somewhere should you ever want to go back to it, but look at this cool special thing that I have. So yeah, I'm with you 100%. I'm sorry for ranting about that again. I just obviously feel really strongly about the no cut stuff. And on the opposite side, I love to see the crazy stuff people come up with when you have a shell that you could feel free to hack away on. And, if you end up couple years from now deciding you don't like any of those mods anymore, whatever, put the old case back on. So hopefully people will listen and we'll get Model 2, Model 1, Genesis, original Super Nintendo. I think all of those would be very much appreciated by everybody in the scene. Well, that's it for this time. As always, thanks so much to everybody that participates in these. I really do enjoy doing them. And if you're new to these Q&As, ask any question you have. Just please post them in the latest Q&A post, wherever it is that you support. Just the way these services work, it's almost impossible to go through old posts and figure out what's new. And it's just much easier and, to be honest, much more fun to just scroll through the posts in real time like this and kind of answer right off the top of my head. So ask any question you want in the newest post. As I mentioned before, if I ever skip over your question, it's not intentional. I either just deleted it in post or it came in after I started recording. So, as always, thank you to everybody who supports. I really appreciate it. You're what's keeping all of this stuff going. So thank you very much, and I will see you next week.